I think that I saw the 1997 version first, if my memory serves, and that's, always up for debate. But I remember watching it with my dad, and I would have been, when did 97? Hang on, let me math for a second. Would have been like 15.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember watching it with my dad, and it's really good. The cast is phenomenal. And I remember my dad going, "Well, that's an old movie, right? That's a remake." And I was 15, I had no idea, and it was probably a couple of years before I went back and watched the original. And it is also incredible. But I think that as far as remakes go, they did a pretty good job with the 1997 version.
Mm-hmm. Like a good job updating it for a sort of more modern audience.
Yes, without destroying it.
Mm-hmm. That I
I'm
mean,
not generally a fan of remakes.
yeah, remakes are hard, especially when the original movie is perfect or close to perfect, which I think all three of us are in agreement that 12 Angry Men is the original version is one of those two.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I just finished watching it about 2 hours ago. The second time, I haven't watched it that many, except for two times, but it just reinforced that.
That it's, damn near perfect. Jacob, have you seen the 97 version or are you only familiar with the original?
Yeah, no, I have not seen the 97 version. I was aware that it existed because I was seeking out a lot of these old movies that I had not seen yet, and saw that there was. I was confused when I first ever looked it up because of the remake being titled exactly the same. And I'll be honest. I think if any movie deserves to be remade today and updated, I think now might be the time to try and remake the original. And basically, not word for word or anything like that. That would be pointless. But to update it, just because I mean, women serve on juries now. you know, it's all the movie all about the prejudices and things. I think you could
Mm-hmm.
maybe sort of reinvent the wheel.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's interesting because I was watching it and I was sort of thinking the opposite, that it is so applicable to, I'm sure it was super applicable in the 90s. It feels super applicable to American society and culture today, that I wasn't even sure if we needed an updated version because this version does still play so well to a modern audience. But I think on the flip side of that, there, 12 Angry Men, women serve on juries too. Not just, white dudes serve on juries now. So you could sort of make those updates to be more reflective of, the America that we live in today and how these same sort of themes, talking points, ideas, philosophies, all sort of still exist in similar and in more updated ways in 2023, as they did when the film was originally made. So that's an interesting point. I was sort of thinking the opposite, but I feel like it could definitely go both ways on that one.
Yeah, I'm with
Before
you. I can see that both ways.
I was just gonna say, before we get into more of the actual movie talk, I feel like this movie in particular, it would be interesting to sort of talk through some of our own experiences with jury duty, how we see it, and things like that. So I think the obvious place to start is with the question: have either of you served on a jury before?
I have not.
Neither have I.
Okay, we are 0 for 3. I have also never served on a jury. Okay, here's my next question, which I feel like is the more important question. When, if and when you guys have received a summons to serve on a jury, what is your initial thought? Are you immediately like, I have to get out of this? Or has it just, not worked out? Talk me through what's happened there.
I'll let RJ go first on this one, and she said she comes from the journalism field too, so She may have similar experiences to me, but I'm going to let her take the reins first.
So I don't think I got a jury summons until I was in my 30s. And I've gotten a couple of them since that first one. But it's never, there's, whatever exemption you can do because I had small kids at home and my husband travels a lot for work. So I did not have childcare options that would make it possible for me to
Mm-hmm.
just indefinitely be sitting in a courtroom. And so I had, uh, I think, legitimate reasons
Yeah.
to not, to do it. So I think generally first thought when I open a jury summons, though, is I got to get out of this. They don't make it look that fun in the movies, in TV, anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, um, I don't want to be I don't want to be one of the guys in this movie sitting there arguing with somebody over somebody else's life.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of
Interesting.
responsibility.
It is a lot of responsibility. Jacob, what's your sort of first thought when you see the summons? What are you thinking? What's going through your head?
Well, so I'm sort of the opposite. I sort of really think it would be fun to serve on a jury personally, and I think that it would be like, okay, I know myself, I know that I'm sort of a critical thinker, I'm a journalist. So it's probably good for me to serve on a jury just because when we're talking about going through evidence,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at this movie just as a comparison, you have one juror who sort of is standing in the gap here for some critical thinking, and a lot of these men are pretty logical, but they're just not. They haven't gotten there. So in that
Mm-hmm.
sense, I sort of would like to serve on one. However, I've only been summoned to a jury one time, and my initial thought is, there's no way in hell they're going to let me serve on this jury
Yeah.
because at the time I was the newspaper editor um, in Troy, Alabama, Pike
Mm-hmm.
County, and so I covered every, you know, pretty much every felony criminal case of any major
Mm.
importance. So,
Yeah.
but however, now the one that I got summoned to was actually like a class C felony, and it
Okay.
wasn't something that really fell under our coverage. So I was like, well, maybe they'll let me serve. So I kept getting called up to the bench, and the judge was like, are you sure you don't know anything about this guy? You can serve on this jury, like, and I'm like, yeah. So, but then they go through the jury selection process, which isn't shown in the movie, but they
Mm-hmm.
asked, okay, does anyone know the sheriff or the DA? And I'd stand up, be like, yeah, I know, I'm familiar with them, yeah. And then they'd say, okay, does anyone know the defense attorney? And I'd stand up, say I've talked to him before. And so, it's just constantly like all the reasons I should not be on the jury.
Yeah. So I'm assuming it didn't work out. Well,
No,
we don't even have to assume. You told us that you've never served, so
but yeah,
it didn't work out.
they brought me to the bench three times, and I told them every time I could do it, but I got
Mhm.
booted.
That that sort of makes sense. Well, both of your guys' reasons for not ending up serving, totally makes sense. I think in another scenario, I'm sure both of you would have ended up serving. So I've also never served on a jury. I've only received one summons. I am still listed with the state as living at my parents' house, which is no longer where I reside. I'm no longer in that same county. So when I got the summons, I thought I've always had a super romantic view of jury duty as a sort of ideal in our democracy. A jury of our peers sort of deciding our fate in a free and open society. And it is my civic duty when I get called upon to serve upon a jury and serve to the best of my abilities. That's my duty as an American. I owe it to my fellow citizens. But I got the summons, or my parents got the summons, and they told me, and I was like, I'm not gonna be able to do it. It's too far away. I can't commit to that. So I guess I'm kind of a fraud. I don't actually stand up for what I believe in. I was very easy I was very quick to back out of something that I thought I held very true to my heart. But once I update my address and everything, and my summons are for the county that I reside in, I will 100% serve on a jury the next time that I am called upon, unless there's something else going on that I can't do it. Maybe like my foot hurts or something, and I don't want to go, or maybe I'm just a little sleepy, my tummy hurts. I don't know, but if that's not the
Hangnail.
case, yeah, yeah, hangnail, any of that. I'm tired. I have tickets to the ball game. Other than that, I will go. I will serve and I will do my duty, and I will be a proud member of a jury. So I think we've all kind of touched on it in terms of like what we generally think about the idea of jury duty, even though we've all sort of gotten out of it. It's funny to think that most Americans, when they receive that summons, when they receive that letter, their first thought is, oh shit, this is something I don't want to do. But in theory, in the abstract, we all sort of see it as a very crucial part of our democracy, right?
Yes.
And Jacob, you touched on this a little bit, but you've covered, you know, criminal trials and things like that. Do you have any more insight in terms of like the types of people who do serve on juries, or once someone is actually on a jury, what the day-to-day process looks like during a trial, during deliberation, all of that stuff? Do you have any more info that you could maybe give us in that sense?
So I've sat in on I've even on jury selections, and sometimes you'll hear someone will stand up and they'll give a really qualified background that shows they've got some critical thinking skills. They're very intelligent. Nothing immediately pressing about their qualifications that would get them off the jury. And then what happens? The lawyers go behind closed doors to strike the jury, which means they each side takes turns kicking some people out. And the jury that ends up being selected usually doesn't include those people, in my experience, for some reason. Some of that may be randomized. I'm not exactly sure, but definitely some of the people get kicked out, and some of that's because the defense. Let's say the defense thinks their client doesn't stand a great chance. They don't necessarily want a perceptive person on the jury, the most perceptive person. They might want to rule them out. So there's a lot that goes into it. But the one thing I haven't obviously been privy to is the jury deliberation, because that's all behind closed doors. So I think that's really sort of interesting that that's what this movie focuses on. And I think that's really key, is that it's a movie about something that we understand happens, but nobody ever sees in terms of like the most public court cases. They come out and they tell you what their decision is, and they don't have to tell you why they voted any which way. So I think that's really interesting. In terms of Alabama, it's a little bit been lower pressure than this movie. Like in this movie, you get the idea that they are in that room and they are sequestered indefinitely until they come up with something. In Alabama, at about
Hmm.
5 o'clock, 5 o'clock, the judge would have said, "Okay, guys, we're gonna go home, break, come back tomorrow morning." So it loses some of that urgency that it has here in this movie. And some do work that way, especially on big cases, federally or maybe other states. But generally in this state, that's not the case.
I wonder if it would have been more common in the 50s.
Probably so. I would think, yeah.
Do you have, from your professional experience, do you have a sense of, at least in coverage that you've done, of how long deliberation usually takes for a jury, depending on, a given trial?
It's often very quick. I mean, Most criminal trials I've been to, the jury deliberation, 1-2 hours maybe. I just covered a theft trial of a politician, and it took, I think, hour and a half, which is
Wow.
on par with this movie. I mean, this movie is sort of real time, an hour and a half of deliberation.
I was
Yeah.
going to ask, do we have any? I couldn't. The movie kind of ebbs and flows with the tension, and so I wasn't sure if we're supposed to be feeling it in real time or if we're supposed to assume that there, is more time passing between one ramp up to the next.
I just fresh off of watching it, I don't think I think it's all in real time, pretty much. I
Yeah, I
can't.
think there's maybe the scene in the bathroom is maybe the only sort of indicator of a passage of time. There might be a few others that happen throughout the movie, but I think for the most part, this probably takes place, I would say at most over 3-4 hours,
Yeah.
because it is over the course of an afternoon, really into the evening. They're out by what? They want to be out by 7. And at one point, maybe an hour into the movie, they mentioned that it's around 5 o'clock. So they must have started around 3. So I mean, maybe between like 3 and 6 or something. It would be my guess, but it is really, and we'll get into it once we actually start getting a little bit more into the movie. But every indication is that this is a longer deliberation than what you would typically see. Um, in any case, and in this particular case that they are deliberating, it is a much longer period of time than I guess what we would normally see. I couldn't stop thinking about the OJ Simpson jury and how long it took them to come to their decision. I feel like theirs was like pretty quick, right? It was like weeks and weeks of trial, and then they decided in like 45 minutes.
Did they?
I feel like it was super quick.
I can't remember. That's
But I mean, let's get into the movie a little bit. The fact that it takes them so long, I think, kind of highlights one of the things that we were talking about with our own experiences, is that this is a big responsibility that is sort of left in the hands of ordinary people. These 12 guys, they are your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends, things like that. They're just everyday people, and one of those everyday people really feels the burden of responsibility that's on them when it comes to someone else's life. And then you see some other characters who are really just sort of flippant about it. They don't necessarily care about the responsibility of what they're supposed to be doing in that room, because they only care about getting to the ball game that they have tickets for that night. And maybe we can start here, but what did you guys think of how the characters were set up sort of immediately in the movie? We get, from very early on, we get a sense of who everyone is and sort of how the dynamics are going to be at play. RJ, you can start us off with your first, initial thoughts on that.
I as far as the jurors, I think one of the things that kind of struck me in the beginning, but kind of also over the course of the movie, is how they managed to come up with such a range of personalities for what doesn't seem to be. I mean, it just at first glance a very broad range of people. Um, like you pointed out, like there's no women. They're all kind of middle-aged men. Obviously, there's the one guy who's older. Um, there's one who's I think some kind of minority or an immigrant. That's it's hard to they don't really specify, but they all have pretty distinct personalities. Most of them kind of annoying, actually.
I think
But
that's a
I'm
fair
with you.
assessment.
Like these guys, a lot of these guys, I'm like, oh, that reminds me of this person. That reminds me of this person. So it does feel very authentic in good
100,
and bad ways.
100%. Yeah, definitely good and bad ways. Jacob, what did you think of that initial sort of introduction to all the characters and then how the dynamics played out across the course of the movie?
Yeah, I think that's pretty on the nose. So I don't, you know, some of the jurors come off at the start a little bit like rough archetypes, or maybe a little bit of a caricature. But for the most part, you get a good sense of the people being very real, very authentic, with built-in sort of prejudices, and they're all distinct enough. And you don't get all of that from the start. Some of it takes a little time to a couple of the quieter jurors, but by the time, I think we get to the end of the movie, every member of the jury has sort of played a part and sort of established a sort of distinct voice for themselves, and sort of a few of them, really go through some arcs, of course. Just in terms of, like, I know one of the guys is a bit more timid at the beginning, and sort of seems to start to get into it a lot more near the end. So I think it was a really strong group of characters.
Which guy was that exactly that you were
Well, it's
referring
hard.
to?
It's hard because they don't have names, but he has a little bit more of the nasally voice.
Is he one of the
Uh,
guys with glasses?
yeah,
I
yeah.
think
The
so.
shorter guy? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, because you brought it up, let's talk about that. How genius is it to not give any of these characters names?
Yes. That is one of the things that I wrote down. Um, I don't want to skip ahead, but I didn't really. I think it didn't really occur to me until the very end of the movie when two of the characters, exchange names and go on about their days. That I was like, wait, no, nobody ever said their names. That's
Yeah, they all just refer to each other as the gentleman, that guy over there, Mr. Sir, and all of that stuff. But yeah, Jacob, what did you think of all that?
Well, I do think it was very smart, and it seemed very natural that they were introducing themselves, but they weren't necessarily saying their names. I mean, you could maybe argue jury members would probably know each other's names, but I think it was a pretty smart, and it takes the focus off of, we don't really care what their names are. We care about who they are and what's driving them. Names, the only thing that names would have helped is us reviewing this movie and
yeah.
talking about the characters. Because
Yeah,
with juror number one, but in the movie you never get lost or confused. That's not necessary. You recognize them by their faces. They've all got, good, they're all distinct from each other. You can tell everybody apart, and it doesn't get confusing in the slightest.
a lot of great faces in this movie. Just like this is character actor heaven, you know?
Yeah.
Bunch of dudes with very distinct faces sitting in a room and talking for an hour and a half. It's beautiful. But I that moment at the end where the two men, Henry Fonda's character and the older gentleman, once they exchange names and you realize, oh, we didn't know the names of any of these characters, even though we know them so well after all of this time that we've spent with them. But also, within the movie, narratively, for those guys, like they just went through a very life altering experience together. And to think that you can go through something like that with people whose names you don't even know and sort of be transformed as a person is sort of a really beautiful thing. And I wonder if the movie is trying to say that that's something that we don't get out of a lot of situations in life, but something like serving on a jury is a unique opportunity to go through something so beautiful like that.
It's well put.
Um,
Yeah.
so we kind of touched on this a little bit too, but the the characters, the actors, the faces, who were some of your favorite performances? Who were some of the jurors that you guys connected to most? Who were some that you disliked the most? Walk me through some of that.
So this is a little strange, but I think that my favorite character was actually the angriest of the 12 Angry Men. Uh, so Lee Jacob is the actor, which he looks so familiar to me, but I can't place what else he's been in.
He's
But
in. He has one of those faces.
yeah,
He's in On the Waterfront. Have you ever seen that?
it's
The
possible.
the Marlon Brando movie, but um, yeah, he's one of those faces that you just feel like he's in everything. Every movie that's in black and white that you've ever seen, he is somewhere
Yeah.
in there being angry.
Yes, yes. And he's very good at it. I mean, you're supposed to dislike his character. He is not a likable human. Even if you removed the his personal bias that is, keeping him on the side of like, let's hang this kid right now. He's very, very angry, but he does it so well. It's really good art to watch him. And I mean, he goes through obviously a very big moment at the end, but and that I do appreciate that he does have some sort of little breakthrough. Although from what we've seen the rest of the movie, I can't imagine that that's going to be any kind of permanent shift in thinking. Um, but
Hmm.
but just his vitriol is he's very good at it. Like he's
Yeah,
not likable at all, but he's very good at not being likable.
yeah. You don't, right? We don't like the character, but we can be in awe of all of the art that's going on there between the writing of the character, the way that the character is portrayed by Cobb, just like I wouldn't say necessarily a tour de force, but a really like he's got a lot to chew on and he is freaking chewing on it. Um he wasn't going to be sold short in that performance at all. Jacob,
Yeah.
did you have a favorite, least favorite, standout character amongst the 12 Angry Men?
So I'm gonna talk about just a couple. So first of all, I think I found really interesting the broker, who is third the third holdout, is the third to last holdout, and unlike the other two, which we just talked um, about who we talked about, but we didn't talk about the just awfully racist old man. But the broker has no kind of doesn't have that kind of prejudice. I think it's really interesting that we're looking at this whole movie. We're talking about the logic and sort of breaking down how the evidence is portrayed, and he's just stuck on a very he's got a logical thing that he um, can't get over until the sort of final evidence breakdown. So I thought he was really interesting because he was, an antagonist in a way for holding out so long, but not so much a villain like the other two. And then, um, and then I think the old man just really brings something every time he gets on there. Just has that little spark in him, sort of his screw you attitude to the guys who were just trying to run the ship down. And and plus, I mean, come on, he's the one that figured out the glasses problem at the end. I mean, you know, uh, he really revealed some really smart thinking at the end there. So
Yeah, the old dude might be the MVP. He's he's great. He's the first one to flip too, right?
Yep.
yeah, and you know what? Watching it today, he didn't even completely flip on his first vote. He did it to keep the discussion going. Um, he says, "Yeah."
Interesting.
He says, "Yeah, I don't know. I think he might still be guilty, but this man took some courage to stand alone, and I think he deserves us to keep talking. So
Yeah. Well, okay, let's talk about this for a little bit. I think this movie is really interested in the idea of being open to thoughtfulness and being inquisitive, and there is a really clear sort of dynamic dichotomy between those who are interested in being inquisitive and those who are not. And at the end of the day, I think there may be maybe only two characters who are anti-thought, and it's juror number, is he two or three, the angry guy, the most angry of
Three.
the angry men. He's number three, and I believe it's juror number seven, who is the slightly older gentleman who he's probably the sweatiest of all the men. This movie could be called 12 Sweaty Men, but that's a discussion for another day. I think he's the sweatiest guy, and he's always standing up and he's patting his head. But that guy is so against the idea of, what do you call it? Thinking. Like, that dude is all feeling, no thoughts. And this movie is, and Jacob, I think this goes back to what you were saying about this movie being able to be updated for an audience today, because that's still something that we deal with in modern society. Like, modern American discourse is, some people are just really they have a gut feeling and you can't tell them otherwise, and other folks are maybe a little bit more interested in thinking things through, in asking questions, in trying to find logical through lines between things. And I don't know, I just thought that the way that those characters sort of represented those two different sides of the coin, with juror number 8, who's our main guy, and the old man, and then I think it's juror number 10, the big sweaty guy, and juror number 3, the angriest of the angry men. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that or
are,
anything to add.
are we talking about the guy obsessed with the baseball game here?
No, but that's another guy who we should talk to or who we should
So
talk about at some point.
in many ways, here I'll go ahead and start. Um, in, in many ways, he's almost as despicable as any of the jurors because unlike the racist guy who's just completely prejudiced against everybody from the slums and the guy with his own issues with his son, this guy doesn't have necessarily prejudices holding him back. He's just worried about his own self interest, and he just flops over to not guilty just because it gets him to his baseball game faster. So I mean, that's in many ways as despicable as anything to put someone's life on the line or let someone go free just based on how it affects your plans. I mean, that's pretty rough.
I,
And not
I
just
couldn't
your
agree
own
more.
plans. Sorry, RJ, keep going.
I definitely agree. I can't. I mean, you know, the the angriest of the men. Obviously, he has a bias because of his issues with his son. The other guy, supremely racist, but at least they believe that they're in the right. They don't think that they're just condemning this kid for no reason. Like, they vehemently believe that it's the right thing to do to send this kid to his death
They have
because
some
he
sort of
absolutely, they think he killed his dad. I mean, which is, if you're on a jury and you're really pretty sure that the person who did what they are being accused of is guilty, then isn't the right thing to vote guilty?
yeah, they have
Uh,
some sort of what's the word that I'm looking for? It's not just conviction, but some sort of, we'll edit it out.
yeah.
But yeah, that
but
dude,
but yeah, the guy he's just willing. He has no scruples, no care for human life. It's just he just wants to get to a ball game, and that irritates the hell out of me.
yeah, it's not
He is my
only
most disliked character, actually.
it's not even just acting in your own self-interest. It's acting in your own self-interest for the most trivial of things. It is a baseball game. It's a random baseball game on like a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the summer. That guy will be able to go to hundreds of other baseball games throughout the course of his life. He'll be able to go to a baseball game the next day, and still he is so selfish. He's so self-interested that he is willing to overlook the fact that we are talking about matters of life and death when it comes to this young boy, when it comes to respecting the honor of someone who has passed away, someone who is brutally murdered. And he doesn't give a shit about any of those people. All he cares about is his damn baseball game.
And I think it might be the only time in the movie where someone confronts one of the jurors confronts another juror who's on the same side as them. I mean, one of the guys who's now switched over to not guilty confronts him and says, "What are you doing? You know, what if you think
Yeah.
he's not guilty, vote not guilty. If you think he's guilty, vote guilty. Don't just go with the flow."
Yeah, and it shows that, because the movie sort of starts off and Fonda's seen as the only one who's really taking it seriously, who feels the weight of the responsibility. But when it comes to that guy who's flip-flopping, we learn that even the folks who are voting guilty, they're also taking it seriously. Now, we may disagree with their worldviews and things like that, but they are at least taking it seriously, even enough to the point where they're willing, maybe not willing, but they will have the conversation, and they will listen to the other side of the conversation, which obviously we get to the point where they end up listening at the end of the movie. But yeah, there's nothing more disgusting than being flippant about life and death matters because you want to go to a baseball game. So I'm glad we all agree on that. That guy, grade A jackass. I will say though, speaking of grade A jackassery, writing everyone off who comes from the slums, also
Oh,
grade A jackass. And the scene where that dude is giving his monologue about how they all are from the slums and they're born violent and there's nothing we can do. So obviously, this kid must have done it, which is also a really bad argument for why like one specific person committed a murder. But I guess that's the point of
yeah.
the movie. But the scene where that dude is going on and it's just that single shot of everyone getting up from around the table and looking away to not acknowledge the nonsense that he's spewing is, to me, probably the most beautiful scene in the movie. And while we're on that, do you guys have other favorite scenes of this particular flick?
Yeah, I mean that's obviously a terrific scene and particularly sort of consequential. Also the final scene, the way when the last juror is giving his reasons, the one that has the problems with his own son, and there is no conversation and just the reaction shots, just the other 11 jurors sort of staring him down until he crumbles under his own weight or whatever, a burden. That's a pretty meaningful shot. But just personally, rewatching it today, I remembered I had forgotten the scene with the knife where they pull out and he stuck it on the table and they're talking about how it's such a unique knife and then you know, juror number 8 pulls out an identical knife and just stabs it into the table. I mean, just it's just a badass moment of I've been holding a card. Uh, just what do you say about that then? Uh, I just
That's
like
a
And
moment.
how are y'all feeling about that moment though? From a, say this is a real case, this is a real jury. I mean, isn't it a little bit shady for a juror to be trying to conduct his own investigation, kind of?
It is it's a little problematic. Look, that's what's so great about it. It's shady. I mean, he broke the law in getting the switchblade. It's said right there, and but it proves a point. And sometimes it's like, well, that was a little bit over the line, but hey,
Yeah. Well, I
it
like it because it makes the protagonist not, I mean, he's not just, oh, this is the ultimate good guy. Like, he's better than everybody else. He's the one that, like, no, he's, not necessarily in the right on everything that he's doing or saying, even, but, I mean,
Interesting.
it's good intentions, of course, but
That's
I don't
very
know. I don't,
funny. I didn't think of it that way. I was just thinking like, wow, this is the moment that kicks the movie into overdrive. That's at what moment does that come? 15 minutes in, 20 minutes in,
it's somewhere
and
around there. Yeah,
up to then, it's sort of going along at a solid pace. They're arguing, you're sort of getting the feel for all the characters, and then he whips that knife out, and you're like, oh shit. Things are going to get crazy in this room. Things
and
are going to get real weird.
just a little bit
yeah.
further on, just the knives a couple of times come out, and it just adds. Even though it's like the situation does not, like, none of these jurors are probably going to stab each other. It gets close maybe, but just the way it's framed, sometimes just having the knife in the scene just sort of adds a tension.
Oh yeah. 100%. So I
I
think
was to
we've
say,
talked
I
about
think it would have been a really good plot twist if he had like whipped the knife out and said, he couldn't have stabbed it because I did, and then the movie's
oh
done.
man. In in a really bad remake, the knife scene
Yeah.
doesn't happen until the end, and that's when we find out that juror number 7 was the actual murderer. Which, if done correctly, could be a cool movie, but would most likely just be very annoying.
Okay, so I won't write that. That's
Try it out. It might be great. It might be great. You never know. We never know until we take the chance, which is the next sort of area of the movie that I wanted to talk about is the ballsiness of the script and the structure of this movie, which I feel like doesn't get talked about enough, or maybe it does and I've just been living under a rock. But I watched this movie yesterday. I watched it with my girlfriend, and I was like, "Do you want to watch 12 Angry Men with me?" She says, "What is 12 Angry Men?" I go, "It's a movie about 12 white guys in black and white in one room talking for an hour and a half about whether or not someone murdered someone else." And she said, "That sounds like the most boring thing I've ever heard." And it makes sense because that does sound like the most boring thing that anyone has ever heard of. What do you mean that's going to be an exciting movie? What do you mean that's one of the best movies ever made of all time? The fact that this whole movie, with the exception of like a minute on the front end and like maybe 45 seconds on the back end, it all takes place within one room and it's just these guys talking. How ballsy is that? Do you think that that would play in any other scenario? Whoever wants it.
So,
I'm sure. Oh, go ahead, Jacob.
okay, what I love about the structure of this movie, and yes, it could be very boring. And honestly, I've tried to watch a lot of the sort of 50s era movies that are acclaimed, and a lot of times I've struggled with them. And I had a healthy amount of concern that this one would be really boring when I got to watch it, and it was anything but, of course. But I'm fascinated by how this movie is sort of a film noir in reverse. It's like
Interesting.
when you look
Hmm.
at, it's like you're putting, usually you follow the detective or whatever, and he's putting together all these disparate pieces and figuring out what makes sense, and then finally you come up with the killer. And in this sense, you start out with a presumed killer, and then you start going backward through the evidence and tearing it all apart and figuring
Interesting.
out what doesn't add up. And then also at the same time exploring prejudices and pulling it apart. But I'm sure, and some of y'all might be able to talk better about this than I can, but there's so many things done in terms of the camera movement and the sense of tension. I think, we mentioned it could be called 12 Sweaty Men. I think the air conditioning and the heat even though those are low stakes compared to the stakes of the boy's life on the line, I think it adds some stakes and adds pressure, and then you see the sweat, which we sort of associate with tension, even though the technical reason for it in the movie is the heat that they're in a pressure cooker of a room, physically and sort of mentally, emotionally. Um, Also, one other thing I'd comment on watching it today again, I love at the start when the judge reads the jury whatever he tells the jury, of their role, and he's sort of almost like exhausted. But then right before you transition into the opening credits in the jury room, you just sort of see the boy for the only time you see him, with just he's just
Oh
staring
yeah.
off, about to find out his fate. And that's just so effective, I think, in starting that out, to see him really quickly, and he doesn't look like a killer per se. I mean, he looks like a young, maybe innocent boy. And then you get into talking about all the evidence. It was very effective to me.
100%. I'll just say one quick thing on that. I would almost disagree with your word choice of quickly. I feel like that shot hangs on him for so long, and then we get that crossfade of his face with the room, and his face stays on screen for an alarming amount of time, especially for a sort of like cross dissolve
That,
sort of
yeah,
thing going on. And
that is
it's
true.
like, the weight of this boy and his fate, because he is just a boy, right? And we get that from that one shot, but the weight of him is hanging over these 12 men. And it really, I guess, like subconsciously, we are thinking about that the entire time that they're in the room, which is the whole movie. I'm sure there are like certain camera angles or cues that really like remind us of the boy's face based on like where that initial edit happens, where we keep going back to the idea that this is all about him, what these guys are going through. And no matter how much we're watching their interpersonal dynamics uh working at play with each other within the group, it's all really about, the tension is really about the boy, which is really great.
I actually saw it a little bit differently. I feel like
Please expand.
I I like that, we see him at the beginning, so we know what we're talking about, and then we don't see him. If I'm remembering correctly, I don't think we ever hear his name said, um, because in my view, he's actually a little bit irrelevant to the plot and the point of the movie. And even whether he is guilty or innocent, I would argue is actually somewhat irrelevant, because the purpose of the movie is really about how, I don't know how to say this, how our own personal biases cloud the way we see the world. And they go through all of the evidence, and of course they end up finding him not guilty, but at the end of the day, I mean, it could have gone the other way as well. Like, they could have gone through all the evidence and it turned out he was guilty, but the important thing is that they did it, that they talked through it, that everybody kind of worked through their own personal issues and made a decision based on what was there, what the evidence was, not whatever their particular bias was, which is another thing. I enjoyed the fact that there was such a range of biases. It wasn't just, like, oh, everybody's a racist or hates poor people or whatever, but everybody had some different thing that was clouding their judgment.
Well, what were some of the other biases that you saw at play? And I think that that's a beautiful reading of the movie, even though it's not the reading that I had. I think that reading is, yeah, I think that's fantastic.
I think that's the really great thing about a movie like this, is that it allows everybody to find in it something different. But as far as your question
Art,
about the
it's
biases,
great.
Yes, art is good. Um, so there's, I mean, obviously the old guy that's really aggressively racist. There is the oh, what was he? He was a banker or finance guy or something like that, and he had actually like no personal feelings. He just was all about the logic, which is
Hmm.
in itself, I think, I mean, can be a handicap. Um,
Yeah.
and there was talk about the neighborhood he's from. He's from a poor neighborhood. It just, I mean, kind of everybody seemed to have their different thing. And then there's the guy with the damn baseball tickets that he his own. I don't know if you call it a personal bias, but his bias was towards going and doing what the hell he wanted to do and not actually caring about other people.
Yeah. His
Um,
bias was being a huge jackass.
yeah,
There and it's not just prejudice. Sorry, I don't want to cut in.
no, go for it.
But in addition to biases, just also the different backgrounds and experiences. Because I mean, the guy from the slums, he wasn't biased against the kid being from the slums, but his background a couple of times came into play and was an important part.
Oh yeah, like with the stabbing motion, with the
Yes, yeah,
proper way of
like
stabbing. Yeah.
all of that. Yeah.
One guy who we haven't talked about yet, who I feel like is a pretty interesting character, even though he's a pretty minor character, is the guy who I kept referring to as Don Draper, the ad man in the group, who I feel like his shortcoming was his inability to fully take this seriously in the way that I think deep down he wanted to. He just wanted to network. He wanted to tell people about his job. He wanted to tell them, how things are done within his company when they have meetings and are brainstorming ideas and things like that. But then they sort of crack his shell, and at the end, you can see that he really does feel the weight of everything that's going on throughout the entire course of the movie. Did you guys find him as interesting as I did, or did you think that he was sort of just a nothing character?
I'll ask a clarifying question. Was he the one who kept flip flopping towards the end?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay. Then yeah, I liked that there was that character who was not that was easily swayed back and forth by either side. I mean, because that that's a very true to life thing. Like there are people who are very easily influenced by other people's opinions, and they that find it easier to kind of go with the flow.
It's also interesting that the person who seemed to be most impressionable in that sense was the guy who worked in advertising. His whole job is to convince people of one thing or another. And within that room, he had zero ability to convince anyone of what he was thinking because he doesn't know how to think. He just knows how to convince people. But in this situation, he was the one who was being impressed upon of what others were selling to him, which I thought was pretty interesting. I think there are a few other angry men who we haven't talked about a whole lot. I think the last one that I'm a little bit interested in is the foreigner. I don't know if it was said where he was from. It seemed like he was from some sort of Eastern European country. Did you guys have any thoughts on him and sort of what he was bringing to the table? I thought he had some interesting moments to shine as well.
So he was the one when the baseball ticket guy flip flopped. Wasn't he the one that called him out?
I think that's yeah. I think right. I think that's right.
Okay. Um. Yeah, I thought he was quiet, but when he spoke, his insights were, I think, a very different point of view than probably a lot of you know, the other 11 angry men.
Yeah, he kind of spoke to the significance of juries and jury deliberation in terms of like American ideology as a whole,
Yeah.
which I think is something that is unique to an immigrant. You know, the three of us were, I assume you guys were born here. We were born here, we were raised here. We don't really know anything else besides American life. And I think it takes someone who has escaped from, let's say he's from the USSR or something where freedom is not guaranteed. And the jury is also the judge who is also, an arm of the dictatorship that you're living under. And here we're sort of afforded this lovely freedom of a jury of our peers, even though so many times as peers we want to refuse that opportunity to serve on them. But I thought that was really cool to have an international immigrant character to sort of hold the mirror up to us and say, "Hey guys, this is why this is important." And as someone who used to not have this, I take this really seriously, and I want you all to as well.
And especially the juxtaposition of him with the baseball loving American who could care less about the jury process and why it's so important. I think that is again, like RJ said, he's very quiet, but that moment in particular was very impactful.
100%. Before we start to wrap things up and talk about our recommendations and all that good stuff, so much of this movie and so much of what makes this movie great is the characters. It is the narrative. It is the story and how it sort of develops over the course of the movie. But I do think that the choice of putting this movie in just one room and having it, having it be in a single location does sort of limit the director, but also offer some cool opportunities to do some cool things sort of cinematically with editing, with character blocking, with camera movement. There's not a lot of camera movements in this. So you realize whenever the camera is moving, whenever there's a zoom or something like that, that it has a lot more significance. Was there anything specific that you guys noticed in any of those fields or any other sort of, we'll say more technical aspects of the movie? Was there anything that you guys were picking up on specifically?
So I have two things. And this is actually, I wouldn't say that I realized this as I was watching it, but I was reading an article about the way it was shot, and the camera starts out higher and progressively moves lower throughout the film. And I think he said like further, like a further away lens, something I am not an expert in anything technical about shooting a movie now or in the 50s. But the idea was to give the illusion of the room kind of growing smaller around them.
Interesting.
Yeah. I thought, and it's when I read that, I thought, yeah, like it does seem like they get more, like the space is being sucked out of the room kind of as they go along. And that to my second point, and that is the weather. The weather's kind of like the 13th juror outside, kind of uh making everybody hot and sweaty and angry, which I can't blame them for being angry in sweltering heat. And then as the tension kind of ramps up, then at some point this they're talking about a storm's coming, and then the dam breaks and it just starts pouring rain. um and I thought that was, I don't know if, I'm not good at seeing symbolism in things, but it seemed to be good symbolism for kind of how things were going in the room. That there was
Yeah.
just, all of this tension boiling, and finally it.
Into just like sort of one big like release. Um
Yeah,
and I know Fonda's billed as the lead of this movie and he's sort of our protagonist, but if we're looking at it through the lens of your favorite juror, RJ, the angriest of the angry men. If we're looking at it through the perspective of him as sort of our main character, that weather analysis that you're bringing to us totally makes sense, where we're waiting for the storm, and then at the end when he breaks down about his son, that's the storm at the end of the movie. It all sort of culminates. He's crying the way that the rain is coming down outside, if you're looking for kind of symbolism and stuff there. But yeah, that's, I mean, both of those points are excellent.
Yep, and as just as quickly as it comes, it's done, and there's that
Hmm.
that kind of uncomfortable calm after a storm.
Jacob, was there anything that you were picking up on, sort of, in those technical aspects of the movie, um, due to the location, the writing, and all of that stuff?
Yes, I got one thing. I'm gonna go back real quick though, because there is a juror that we have shamefully forgotten to sort of celebrate here.
Oh
Uh,
no.
Probably the most, maybe just overlooked. The foreman is just a really solid dude, you know.
Hmm.
From the and it's interesting because he's not the protagonist. He's the foreman. You would think maybe the foreman would be our protagonist, but just from the very beginning, always just facilitating this thing, keeping it on the rails as best as he can, and just fighting for the jury process to be done correctly. I mean, he doesn't, get a lot of shine, but I think he really, regardless of his changing views on the case, he really kept it together. But in
I
terms
think
of,
that's a really good point.
I mean, he's sort of the perfect
Hmm.
foreman, even though, yeah, I mean, really, he's just a perfect foreman. He did great, but
There's a lot of room in that room for things to just completely go sideways, and he doesn't do it by being loud or the focal point or the center point. But that's a great point, that he keeps everything together, that he keeps everyone sort of focused, and he's able to wrangle all of the personalities and angry men. He's able to wrangle them in and keep them focused on the task at hand. It's a great shout.
so from a technical side, I'm not always really good, especially if I haven't watched the movie repeatedly with this, but I listened in a couple of times, and so as far as my knowledge, there's no score in this film. There's like zero music.
There's
Uh,
one at the end,
okay,
when Fonda is walking out of the room. It's a pretty standard, just sort of triumphant, we did it, we saved the
sure.
day sort of score. But other than that, yeah, there's like little to no music throughout the movie.
And so, like, I mean, every single bit of, there's no music leading you in any which way. It's all dialogue, and maybe there's a bit of a melodical aspect to the dialogue, not in a sing-songy way, but I mean, just the heightness, you get quiet times and loud times and things. But I just thought that was really interesting that there's no score, and the fact that the movie has to keep moving along without losing your attention, without, a lot of times if you watch a very quiet scene and there's no music, it just sort of feels awkward. But that's never, it's really not noticeable. You have to be listening to see what the score is to really think even about, oh yeah, there's no music.
100%. The way that the dialogue carries this movie, and I kept thinking about the beats that were being hit by the dialogue, by sort of the scene progression, was just absolutely beautiful. I told you guys I watched this with my girlfriend, and by watched it with her, I mean she sat on the couch and was looking at her phone while I watched the movie. And I was fully engaged the whole time with each sort of revelation, and with different lines as they were being read. I was laughing, I was exclaiming out loud, I was sighing, I was, it got a really emotive response out of me, which is not typically how I watch movies. I sort of tend to watch them in not even like a more critical way, but just a more quiet way, and try to like absorb it that way. And with this one, I was like fully reacting to everything that was happening throughout the movie, which is really cool. And to be able to do that and to be able to get that sort of emotional response out of an audience without a score or without a lot of music is really really hard. Musical cues in movies are super important to understanding what you're supposed to be feeling at a given time, and this movie does that without it, which is freaking awesome.
I do think that it is just part of the amazingness of this of the dialogue and of the actors that they are able to build the tension with their voices, with their body language, with the the camera angles and just the way that the scenes flow into each other. It is beautiful art.
And
It
the way that
is.
they're sitting around the table, and some are standing, some are sitting, and the way that changes sort of creates a movement and action that it makes what could be a sort of stale room feel more alive. I think that's also part of it.
Oh, and it's got to change. I wish I were. I wish I were a little bit smarter so I could understand how their movement, their standings versus sittings, their walkings to different parts of the room, how that all is informing the way that we understand their dynamics within the room. I'm sure all of those things are changing with all those movements. I'm just not smart enough to know how exactly it's doing that.
Me neither. Yeah. The one the one element though I think of this movie that sort of gets overlooked because everyone talks about how great the how it explores prejudices and things, but the the evidence and the testimonies and coming together to figure out how those things contradict each other outside of all those prejudices is fantastic. I mean, the train must have been moving at this time, so how could he hear this and all of that stuff? I mean,
Oh man, yeah,
that sort
that
of is lost in the rush, but that's really solid.
yeah, that train scene really messed me up. I was like, what the hell? How are these guys putting this together? But it's so cool because you think about movies and TV shows that are about the legal system, and so much of it is actual courtroom drama, right? It's the actual trial itself. That's where all those bombshell revelations sort of happen. I can't think of another movie that is at least sort of focused. There's definitely not anything that I can think of that is fully focused on the jurors and their deliberation process. Like the fact that there are no lawyers, no attorneys, doing their thing in the courtroom. There's very little judge, all of that stuff. Like that's ridiculous. And I think the fact that there's so few movies that are like this in that sense is another indicator of how truly bold this movie is to take on what it's taking on the way that it's taking it on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is unrelated to that, but it reminded me of another thing that I was thinking about when I was watching this movie. Have you guys seen? Oh God, I'm going to sound so lame saying this out loud. Uh, I'm assuming that probably neither of you were the target market for the TV show Charmed.
Is Charmed the one with, oh my god, what's her name? Is that
Alyssa
Milano?
Milano. Alyssa
Yeah.
Milano. It was Shannon Doherty in the beginning, and
Yeah.
I can't think of the other one's name. But
I'll tell you the only reason I know Charmed. So I'm like a pretty big sports guy, and Charmed is always on TNT in the morning. And when you watch like NBA playoff basketball and leave your TV on TNT at the end of the night, when you turn the TV on in the morning, Charmed is always on. And that is the only way that's the only reason that I know Charmed. And like there are tons of guys in my demographic who only know Charmed through that, which is hilarious. But now I want to hear about the actual show.
so they do a kind of 12 Angry Men episode that is not any, I mean, it's not anywhere near as dramatic or, high quality art. It's, it's more hokey and fun. But so I guess so the premise of the show is that there are three sisters and they're witches, and one of them gets premonitions. It's Alyssa Milano's character, and she is on a jury. And as they're going into the deliberations, she gets a premonition that the guy who did it is innocent. So she's in this room trying to keep the jurors from convicting him while her sisters are off trying to, find evidence that he's innocent or whatever. But it's, if I hadn't, seen 12 Angry Men when I was younger, the reference would have completely gone over my head. But it was, it's like, oh, like obviously the writers have seen a movie, but I imagine that probably for most of the audience, it was probably lost on them. And I also, at some point, I can't think of, Jennifer Love Hewitt, I think I saw, and it was probably a similar situation, and the TV was left on, and I happened to catch a few minutes of a show that I think it was her in, and it was the same kind of thing. She's trying to convince or trying to help a jury not convict an innocent man.
Is it Ghost Whisperer?
That might have been. I didn't watch, like, that was not a show that I spent any time watching. And in my defense, I was I watched Charmed when I was a teenager, so
no defense is needed for Charmed. I'm sure it's a wonderful show. I've just never watched it outside of the scenario that I explained earlier.
It's good entertainment. But when you mentioned that, like that these were the premise is bold and that's done very well and not hasn't been done a lot since, that reminded me of that. And I will not say that those instances that I saw were done very well, but it's entertaining at least.
That's what we're here for. I wonder if those are going to be in your recommendations. Before we get into all of our recommendations, the last thing that I just wanted to say in terms of like the technical aspect of the movie, and again, I wish I was smart enough to explain this in ways that were actual forms of critical analysis instead of just like pointing out things that could maybe be cool and waiting for someone else to fill in the blanks. There's not a lot of like reverse shot, sort of like conventional conversation dialogue editing in this movie. It's a lot of just close-ups of a single person's face. So because we're mostly just getting these guys in shots of just their faces without like anyone else in the shot or any indicator that there's anyone in the room, it does really give us that sense that these are all 12 individual people who are in very few ways connected to each other, in line with each other, even within the same room or on the same page as each other. And then the few moments that you get where you do get those like sort of more wide shots of everyone together or some of them together, I feel like that's just another sort of thing that's happening in this movie that is really utilizing how the script is set up and how the story is going to be told, and taking that and using like actual tools of cinema to further the points that are trying to be made within the script and the story and things like that. Again, I wish I was smart enough to actually talk about it in any real way, but sorry, listener, you're stuck with us. So that's the analysis that you get. But we hope you enjoyed it. I had a great time talking about this movie with the both of you. I hope you guys had as much fun as I did. I feel like you guys were bringing some really cool insights into 12 Angry Men. Listener, we'll talk about how you can reach out to us after we do recommendations. Let's jump into our recommendations. RJ, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, so refresh my memory. Do we go like back and forth?
Yeah, we'll go back and forth.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm gonna start with most obvious to least obvious here, and so my first recommendation is going to be A Few Good Men, because if you like courtroom drama, then there's the next best thing to watching these very angry men is watching Jack Nicholson yell at Tom Cruise.
Two angry men.
Yes.
a few angry men, if you will.
That's probably one of the alternate titles.
Yeah, it had to be. Great
But
choice.
yeah, it's a very different, obviously, kind of movie, but man, it's a great one. It's one of those I will
Wonderful.
sit and watch it every time. Any, if it's on TV, if I walk in the room and my husband's watching it, I will sit down, and it doesn't matter if I saw it
Absolutely.
last week.
Yeah.
It's
Very
still so
rewatchable.
damn satisfying.
You can't handle the truth. That's my Jack impression. That's all I've got.
It was impressive.
Thank you. Jacob, what's your first recommend? Well, first you have to give us your Jack impression.
Oh God, I can't even begin. I can't do one. I can't even think of one off the top. Oh man.
Okay, we'll give your recommendation first, and then we'll circle back to that.
Okay, I'll see if I can't come up with something. Okay, my recommendation, my first one is the most clearly connected. Women Talking. Obviously, very new movie, and it's about a bunch of women talking in a room to each other. So flip the genders, and it's not got anything to do with court, but uh, very similar in terms of just deriving all of its tension, all of its stakes from a group of people talking about the different options they have before them and the different experiences they've had and what this group of women should do after learning that the men have been raping them in their sleep, unfortunately. And it's a Mennonite colony, so there's religious, things going on, and they're trying to. Their whole way of life is built around their colony, so it's very interesting. It fell a little bit short, honestly, of my high expectations for it. I think it could have taken a few more notes from 12 Angry Men and how to make sure the tension stayed. It just lost me a couple of times that I don't think it should have. And so, but overall, it's still a great movie. I would highly recommend it.
You stole my recommendation.
Oh no!
Um, yeah, no, all good. It's a wonderful movie. I'm glad that we were on the same wavelength with thinking about women talking. I do agree. I feel like the movie was at its best when it was doing that, that play on 12 Angry Men, when it was the women talking in a room, that's when it was at its strongest. And I wish it really stuck with that more. Instead, I understand why we had to get to some of the other narrative points that were happening outside of that room. But, when it's in the room, it's really strong. A lot of
Really?
really good performances. I guess just to add on, I would say I haven't read the book, but I've heard the book is also awesome. It's on my reading list. I'd like to check it out at some point. So instead of the movie Women Talking, I will go with the book Women Talking.
Awesome.
I have not seen or read either, but those both sound like damn good premises, or sounds like a damn good premises for a book or a movie.
It's good stuff. You should check it out. What's
It sounds like one
so
of
we're not
those
going to,
that's going to be kind of painful to watch, though.
definitely a little bit painful, but worth the watch. I would definitely say. Look at us, Jacob, being two good guys picking Women Talking.
None of my recommendations involve women talking.
We should change the title of 12 Angry Men to Men Talking. I'm on a heater with these name changes right now.
I hope
RJ,
someone's listening.
Everyone's listening.
Well,
What's
I
the
mean,
point?
someone that can do things about, naming things.
Oh, that kind of someone.
Yeah.
Someone. Not just someone, but someone.
Important someone.
Yeah. What's your next recommendation?
Next recommendation is The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which is, are either of you, I know, Jacob, I
Not
think you mentioned you're
familiar.
not big fan of old movies.
I know of it. I haven't gotten to it yet. I do want to check it out.
Okay, so, I mean, it's not, men sitting around in a room, but it is I believe the late 40s, black and white film, and these two down on their luck guys that are in Mexico for reasons that are never really explained. They fall in with an old prospector and decide to go searching for gold, trying to find their fortunes. And a lot of the movie is the three of them sitting around talking. And much like 12 Angry Men, the conversations go a lot of different directions. And there is increasing tension throughout the movie that ebbs and flows. And the conflicts between these guys, in particular, is oh God, I can't think of it. Humphrey Bogart is one of the main characters, and I can't think of the character's name. But he grows increasingly paranoid when they actually find gold. It's all exciting at first, and they're talking about how they're going to spend their fortunes, but then it's just a kind of a slow descent into madness of greed, and it's so a lot of dark themes, but also a lot of just them sitting around talking, and those scenes are spectacular. So it reminded me of this.
I love it. I've also never seen it, but it's on my watch list as well.
Yeah. So my second recommendation is more men talking. That's
See, I feel like More Men Talking could be the title of like any movie ever made.
That's what they really. It's not a remake. They need to do 12 Angrier Men.
Yes,
that's the sequel.
The sequel.
Where is juror number 3?
Yeah,
the same men get back into another jury.
Oh,
this time, someone actually gets stabbed
against all odds.
I got nothing. Jacob, what's your next recommend?
Okay. Hopefully, Raph, this one shouldn't interfere with any more of your recommendations. It's pretty far out there. So I'm going to recommend Dawn of the Planet of the Apes.
Okay.
Which, where is that? How is that anyway related to 12 Angry Men? But honestly, just a very, if you forget the naming system, the awful naming system of the new trilogy, that's the second movie. But it just really, it does hit on the prejudices in a more nuanced way than a lot of these movies do. You got Koba, who's this ape that was formerly tortured by humans, and he's super prejudiced and wants to go to war or whatever. And then you got a just completely stupid human guy who hates the apes and is just a powder keg waiting to go off. And then you've got the human leader and Caesar, who are both way more level-headed, but they're dealing with these complex issues and just this sort of inevitable war that is just cooking the whole time. And then you've got another human, the real human leader, that's played by Gary Oldman, who ends up also being a very complex character to understand and how he approaches it. And so I just feel like in terms of from a nuanced perspective of those backgrounds of the characters, I feel some connective tissue to 12 Angry Men in that portrayal, if that makes sense.
Definitely makes sense. I've never seen that particular Planet of the Apes movie, but I do like the swing that you're taking in connecting the two. So definitely a solid pick. I will add it to my watch list, even though I saw the first of that trilogy and I saw the last one, and I thought the first one was really cool, and I thought the last one was absolutely abysmal. I think I'm kind of in the minority there, but maybe the second one is cool. So
the second
Jacob,
one is the
I'll
best.
take your word for it. Oh,
I agree. I agree sort of with you. The third one, I didn't see it necessarily as abysmal, but it was a big step down from the second movie.
Okay. I'll check out the second movie. And maybe I'm being too harsh on the third one. So my second recommend is not the Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. So we lucked out there. My second recommend is a Stanley Kubrick movie, one of the few Stanley Kubrick movies that is not in the canon, but a movie that I think is very wonderful. I think it's doing a lot of similar things to 12 Angry Men. There is some sort of trial courtroom drama aspect to it. What I was more thinking of was just like the how the egos of petty men affect the lives of less fortunate men, of men who are maybe in a lower class than them. My second recommendation is Paths of Glory, which if you guys haven't seen, I would definitely recommend it. It is sort of a loose connection to 12 Angry Men, but there are some similar themes at play in terms of, all those things that I was talking about in terms of ego and men being super petty and men just like really being the worst people in the world when it comes to like everything and ruining things for other people uh because their little egos got bruised, so then someone else has to die because of that. Luckily in 12 Angry Men, the kid's fate isn't that he ends up getting the electric chair, but it very much so could have been. And I'm sure in real life there are, tons of kids or young people like him who have had to suffer that kind of fate because of some guy who just votes guilty because he wants to go to the ball game. So, Paths of Glory, that is my second recommendation for today. RJ, what do you
Yeah,
have next?
I haven't seen that one, but that sounds like a good one. So my final recommendations, yeah, I felt kind of like a challenge when you mentioned that someone had recommended a cookbook once. So I was like, well, that's really random. How random can I get?
Let's
And
hear it.
I don't think I quite made it, but are either of you fans of Terry Pratchett?
No,
No,
not
that's a lot of
familiar.
silence.
I guess not.
Okay.
Name
So,
sounds
so
good.
Terry Pratchett is or was he passed away a year or two ago. A British author. He writes a series called the Discworld series. It is fantasy and satire and the most amazing social commentary that I have ever read. One of the books in particular is a book called Jingo, and that is the one I am recommending. Uh, it is so in this fantasy world, the Discworld, there are two nations that are fighting over a piece of land that cropped up in the middle of their, like in the ocean between them. And the two different nations are, it's basically the upper class, the elites want to claim the land on both sides and, you know, do what we do when we take over a new land, even though there's nothing on it. And in the middle of this is the main city that a lot of the books are set in. The watch commander, his name is Samuel Vimes. He is in the midst of this. He hates the rich upper class people, and he finds it to be an extremely terrible miscarriage of justice that there's everybody's being called to go fight over this land that just popped up, and he's the kind of his character is kind of consistently throughout the series is constantly in pursuit of justice at the expense of really whatever may come in between him and finding out, who done it. And it is, I think it's a stretch. It's a stretch, but he reminds me of juror number 8 in that he's against, overwhelming odds in the beginning, and not necessarily intent that he knows what the truth is, but that it is his job to at least make sure that to see that justice plays out, and and isn't just that the people have no voice, and it's not just the upper crust sending everyone to their fates. There's a lot
Sweet.
more involved in the book, but I'm trying to like
That's
pull out
a
the parts that made me
Yeah,
feel like it was kind of related.
interesting. I have not heard of it, but I think that this is also something that will be added to my reading list, which is the beauty of this section of the podcast. We all get so many cool new things to read and watch and sometimes eat, depending on how wild we get with the recommendations. The next time, RJ, the next time you're on, we will be expecting a recipe or a restaurant or something. But for now, I think you gave us some good recommendations.
All right, I'll be working on it.
Yeah. Jacob, what's your final one?
So I'm going to need you to referee here because I don't want to pull a Duke and break the rules.
Unless you're doing like a 3-for-1, you're not pulling a Duke.
Okay. So I'm thinking about recommending a show, but I haven't seen it. It's new, but I think it's very topically related. So I'll do that. So have either of you heard about this new show on Freevee called Jury Duty?
Yes.
Have not.
I haven't watched it, but I've been seeing ads for it.
I've heard a few people talk about it, which it takes a lot in my mind for people to be talking highly of a show on Freevee. So I'm pretty curious. Um, Raph, the premise is it's called Jury Duty, and it's a reality show in which one real guy, gets called to jury duty, and everyone else involved in every other part of the case is an actor.
I love it. I love this concept. I'm so in.
And it includes,
Yes.
it includes James Marsden is on the jury.
And then the one random person doesn't know.
And he doesn't apparently know. I don't know if James Marsden is just playing James Marsden and he just got called into jury duty like anyone else, or if he's playing a different character. That seems
That's funny.
a risk. But
Based on the commercial I saw, I think that is the case. I think that he is playing himself.
so yeah, that's the
So
case.
this guy's like, oh, I just got, selected for jury duty with James Marsden.
Yeah, yeah. And then from there, I think the case itself is just probably insane, and the jury is insane, and this guy thinks all of it is real.
Okay, that is great. I am usually not a TV person. I don't even really know what Freevee is, but I think I got to check out this show. That sounds absolutely bonkers. I'm fully sold. For my last recommendation, I did have something down, and it was something that I kind of touched on earlier in the episode, but I'm going to switch it up because I was at the bookstore yesterday and I was doing some, just some looking around, and every time I'm in this bookstore, so I don't know if you guys have ever been to New York City, but here in New York we have this massive bookstore called the Strand. It's great. It's not so much independent, but it's not Amazon, so it's a cool place to go. They have tons of books. It's three stories, just tons and tons of books. But I always like to go and peruse the film and TV section just to see if there are any interesting movies or interesting books about movies. I like to read about Hollywood as an industry. I like to read critical sort of essays and analysis of films and periods of time in film history, all that good stuff. And one book that I always see and I always think about buying, but I never have come around to doing it is uh, Sidney Lumet's. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but Sidney Lumet's Making Movies. Lumet is the guy who directed 12 Angry Men. So
Mhm.
obviously this guy knows a thing or two about making movies. I've always thought about buying his book. I've never come around to it, but I'm going to recommend it anyway because I'm sure it's awesome and I would like to read it one day. And I'm sure if you're a movie fan and if you're a fan of 12 Angry Men, you would enjoy it as well. So there we go. That's recommendations. Before we get out of here and say goodbye, let's do one last recap of what we're recommending. We'll go in the same order. So RJ, kick us off.
Uh, a few good men. Do I? You just. Yeah, I'm just like
Yeah,
listing
just
them,
the
right?
names.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, A Few Good Men, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and Jingo, a book by Terry Pratchett, or any book by Terry Pratchett, really. And those are my recommendations.
Awesome. Okay, mine were Women Talking, the movie, not the book, because that's Raph's. I had Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and Jury Duty.
And I've got Women Talking, the book, because someone else stole my recommendation. I've got Paths of Glory, the movie, and I've got Making Movies, the book. RJ, Jacob, we did it. We deliberated. We had a good time. We had some good conversation. We thought critically. We looked at the facts. We looked at logic. We had strong opinions, we had strong convictions, but I think we all came to the conclusion 12 Angry Men is guilty of being an awesome movie.
Well
Thank-
played.
Agreed?
Yes,
Well
and
played.
thank God, just in time for my baseball game.